Good afternoon, everybody, and my name is Steve Shogren, and today we're going to talk a little bit about how, for me, I really thought learning Clojure was quite difficult. But first, I want to start us off with a little bit of a story. So when I wanted to sign up to put in this talk to come to LambdaConf, I was very excited about how, I wanted to make sure I got it in early, and I'd thought really carefully through all my presentation. And so, real diligent, I went to my calendar and I said, all right, I know the date is February 1st for when the call for proposals opens. So I set in my calendar, February 1st is when I want to get my email, and just send me an email first thing in the morning, calendar, and let me know, and I'll be ready on February 2nd to start and write my talk and submit it and everything. And I was all excited, and I felt real diligent, and look how thoughtful I was. I don't have to scramble around. So I wake up at maybe 6:15 in the morning, and on February 2nd, and I'm like, there's an email. Oh, don't forget to submit your talk proposal. Oh, excellent. So I open up the website and I click on it and let's just look through, make sure what the abstract would look like, make sure there's no unusual details. And I open it up and it says, call for proposals closed, February 1st. Crap! I thought the date was for the opening of the call for proposal, not the end for the call for proposals. And I'm kicking myself, and I'm laying there I'm so stupid. I thought I was so careful and so thoughtful. And then I'm I close the tab, and I'm I'm just going to surf Reddit in my misery. And I'm like, wait a minute. Wait, it's still February 1st somewhere in the planet, isn't it? Yeah, actually, it's for half an hour more. It's still February 1st in Alaska. Ah, perfect. I know what I'll do. I'm just going to, if I have to, I'll VPN into Alaska, and then I'll submit my talk from there. Perfect. And so I'm scrambling on my phone, and I get it all ready, and I'd already had it mostly written, so I just kind of cleaned it up, edited it, submitted it, refreshed the page with 5 minutes to spare, SurveyMonkey survey closed. Yes! With 5 minutes to spare, slid in like Indiana Jones. So that was my little moment. And I wanted to tell this story because what it showed to me is just how weird is it that I even thought of that, right? How weird is it that after a decade of programming, that's just normal thinking for me, that, oh yeah, wait a minute, it's probably still February 1st technically somewhere on the planet. And what to me, that really symbolizes so well how hard our job really is, right? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to take this messy human culture with these messy conventions and things that don't make sense and were designed this way a long time ago, and we're trying to be the translators into this rigid formal logic of the computer. And that's hard. I mean, in any programming language, no matter what you do, trying to turn those human simple concepts that are messy and organic into rigid logic is always going to be difficult. Some things will be easy, but there's going to be parts that just do not work well. So right off the bat, if you're a programmer at all, even if you're a hobbyist or you're just getting started, you take a second to pat yourself on the back, because what we do is difficult. And the fact that you can do it at all is amazing, right? And that you can take any amount of that fuzziness and turn it into rigid logic, that's impressive. And you've come a long way already. So what I wanted to focus on here, though, is how, in my mind, if I'm learning something and it's hard, I'm getting a lot of value out of that, right? That learning something of value is going to be difficult, because what you're trying to do is stretch your mind to accept these new concepts. And for me, Clojure was exactly that. So to start, what I decided was I wanted to learn a Lisp, because I'd read through all the Polygram, on Lisp, and I'd read through all of the, I hadn't read on Lisp, but I'd read all of his talks and his posts where he's saying how, Lisp is his secret weapon. And I'm like, well, secret weapon sounds awesome, right? I want to be a part of that secret weapon. And not only that, but then, even people like Bob Martin, who I also respect, are saying, wow, Clojure is this great language, it's the future, how excellent this is to learn. I'm like, wow, all right, I really need this. This is getting me even more amped up about it. And then I think what tipped me over the edge is the XKCD comic where he jokes about, Lisps are your grandfather's parentheses, and this is the lightsaber of programming. That's it. If Lisps are the lightsaber of programming, I have to get into that. That sounds super awesome. So I'm all right, I'm going to sit down And at this point, this is like maybe mid-2012, I'd already worked a lot in like Python and Ruby and Java and C# and VB.NET and all that. So I felt like I had, I understood how programming worked at this point. And I think I'd previously, maybe the month before I started, I'd said, I need to start picking up Ruby from Python. And it took me like 15 minutes. Like the differences between Ruby and Python are not that large, right? They're mostly syntactical and maybe new libraries and things. So I felt like, I could just go into Stack Overflow. I could Google whatever I need for writing Ruby, and it pretty much just worked the way I expected. So all right, I'm just gonna write a simple web application in Clojure. It'll probably take me the weekend, but I'm pretty good. It shouldn't be that hard, right? And I remember the first day, it was just like right into a brick wall. I'm just completely stumped, so confused. Like, what is all of this about? And I didn't watch any videos. I didn't really read any books because I was like, that's not my style. I just want to write some code. And I just remember being so confused about every little thing, and just like every idea I had, it was like, nope, it doesn't work that way. Nope, it doesn't work that way. Oh, what if I mutate this? No, you can't mutate that. I'm like, what, why? Why is this all so difficult? And I think there was a moment where I kind of finished it, and it took me about 30 hours. So I didn't finish it that weekend. I didn't finish it the weekend after. I didn't finish it the weekend after. And I got done, and I looked back over the code, and it couldn't have been more than 1,000 lines. Like, it wasn't large. And I looked back and I said, I have no idea what this is doing. I kind of knew, but there were big chunks that I just copied pasted out of Stack Overflow that didn't make any sense to me. And I remember there was one specifically that just like blew my mind when I'm looking at a reduce. It's like reduce plus symbol and then like a list, and it just I couldn't even wrap my head around how terse it was for what all the things that was doing for me that I was used to maybe a huge for each before. And so I said, all right, I got to figure something out because I clearly am not getting it. And really right at that point, I almost was like, maybe Clojure isn't for me. Maybe those guys don't know what they're talking about. But I decided, all right, what instead I'm going to do is I'm going to read a book. And this was a big step for me. I'm like, I'll read a whole book about it, and I'll get good that way. And I downloaded Let Over Lambda and Land of Lisp, which are two books that people had really recommended to me. Land Over Lisp.
What was that first one?
Let Over Lambda. And I'll talk about it in a second. So the first one I started was Land of Lisp, which is like a comic book going through Common Lisp. And I liked the idea about it. Philosophically, it appealed to me because it had humor and artwork and everything. And I got maybe 10 hours into that, and I got to the place where I just was like completely stumped. I'm like, they had like a homework exercise, and I didn't understand it, and I think I probably just like copy pasted too much without really understanding, and so I like, this isn't working out for me. I didn't enjoy it. I was getting frustrated. So then I started Let Over Lambda. Now the guy who recommended Let Over Lambda to me, now in hindsight, I think he was trolling me because he hadn't read it yet. So that right off the bat, I'm like, wait a minute, why did you recommend me a book you haven't even read? And he sent me a copy of it. I hadn't talked to this guy in like 2 years. I mentioned I'm learning Lisp, and he's like, oh yeah, let me mail you a copy of this. Okay, that was a little bit weird. And then thing 3 is, Let Over Lambda is one of the hardest programming books I've ever seen. It is extremely difficult to understand, and it's not even really about Lisp. It's about advanced reader macros in Common Lisp. So Let Over Lambda is like, I'm really good at Common Lisp, and I'm really good at reader macros. I'd like to take it to the next level. I was none of those things, and I don't even think I got through the preface. Like the first page of the preface was like, I don't even know half of these words. Is this a joke? Like, how could this be even a real book? So all right, I put that book down. Like, that's not going to work out for me, right? And then I found Clojure programming. And Clojure programming was a little more my speed, and I was able to read through it. And I got all the way through the book. I didn't do any of the exercises. I was just reading it. And when I got to the end of the book, I said, you know what? I think I know enough about Clojure now to read this book again and understand it. So okay, I'll start it over again and I'll read it again. And by that time, I'm like, all right, the second pass through, it's making a lot more sense. So then, but even then, I tried to go back to Clojure, and I felt like while I understood a lot of the syntax, a lot of the reasons why it was different still didn't make sense. And it was almost like a mindset that I was missing. So, and to really up my game a little bit more, and I wanted to read Let Over Lambda because I thought, well, this guy recommended it to me, and I really respect him. I really should be able to understand it. I started working through Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs, which is a free textbook about Scheme and how to build languages with Scheme. So I finish all of that, do all the homework, which took me about maybe 300 hours, and then I finished Let Over Lambda, which took me about another 50, and then I was able to kind of read back through Land of Lisp, and now I'm like, oh yeah, it makes sense. All said and done, it took me about 450 hours of side projects before I felt really, really comfortable in it. And I distinctly remember about that time, about 450 hours in, I said, you know what, I actually understand this well enough that I could probably start explaining it to others. And I started getting involved in my local meetup, which has Clojure talks and everything, and volunteering to give talks, and simple ones. But I felt like I'd finally gotten that level of mastery where I could start to teach it, and that's when it really started to click for me. So that being said, right off the bat, how many of you have ever had to teach a new programming concept to somebody else? Like a lot of us, right? Like even like the simplest concept, you have to, sometimes somebody comes to you and they're asking for help, or they're stuck, or they're blocked, and we have to help them out somehow. And so, I mean, if you're all here because you want to learn to be better programmers, you want to learn to advance and make yourselves better. And part of that comes with having to then be able to explain to others the things you've learned. So I felt like one thing that would be really useful is I want to give 2 strong pointers for how to help others learn a new language. Because chances are, if you're here, you're probably already good at teaching yourself. You're probably already very good at comprehending new concepts and reading them and things. So the hard part's going to be when you want to go back and explain that to somebody else on your team or somebody else you work with. So the first thing is, when somebody comes to you and they ask for help because they are blocked, and they say, like, in my case, Steve, I don't understand this concept. This is weird to me. I don't get it. I'm just completely blocked. My natural human reaction when somebody comes to me like that is I want to say, oh, that's easy. Don't worry about it. It's this super easy little thing. You just need to do this one weird trick and it's going to work, right? But the problem is that's belittling to them to some extent because they're blocked, right? If they weren't blocked, if they weren't completely stumped, they wouldn't bother really coming to me, right? They would just Google it, or they'd read the syntax tree, or they'd figure it out on their own. If they're coming to me for help, I really think it's because they want a little bit of a human connection. They want some empathy. And so the first thing I have is when someone comes to you for help, before anything else, I recommend think, how can I empathize with them? Even if it's just one sentence. And so what I would recommend is a good example. Somebody came to me the other day, we were learning Clojure, and I was teaching it to someone at my work. And they came and they said, Steve, I'm completely stumped. What the crap is all this pound symbol? The pound symbol is used all over the place, and it's different every time, and it's very confusing. And my first reaction is to be like, well, they're bad-mouthing Clojure, and I like Clojure. And frankly, if they think Clojure's bad, that kind of reflects bad on me, doesn't it? And so I want to take Clojure's side and be like, no, you know what? Actually, it's easy what you're stuck on, and you're just, blah, 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 blah. But instead, what I need to do is kind of fight back against that reaction and say, all right, you're coming to me because you're stumped. You know what? That does sound frustrating. I remember being stuck on that myself for a very long time. Let's sit down and look at it together. Let's sit down at the REPL and pair together and figure it out. And that, I think, makes a huge difference. Because even one time, if someone comes to you and you trivialize what they're stuck on, they're going to remember that for the next time. And the next time they're going to say, oh, that's right. When I needed help, I went to Steve and he kind of made fun of me. And he kind of belittled the fact that I was stuck on this thing. Rather than, oh, that's right. I remember I went to Steve and he empathized with the fact that I was stuck. And he felt like that was, he could empathize with me on that and help me feel better. So that's the first thing. Ally with the human, don't ally with the programming language. Set your ego aside. And you know what? If that guy that came to me, if he had ended up hating Clojure and never using it again because of the reader macro, he would have anyway, right? That's not on me. I'm just here to help him and empathize with him. And if he finds that he hates Clojure, that's a fair opinion. And I need to separate my ego from that tool and separate myself from the language a little bit to be able to accept criticism around it. So that's the first one. When someone comes to you for help, you try to empathize with them first before you try to help them out. The second thing is when someone comes to you and they say something that's incorrect, right? This happened to me very recently. Someone came to me and they said, oh, Steve, I'm learning C# And I don't get how the fact that in C#, an abstract class and an interface are exactly the same thing. C#'s a stupid language. And my first thought is like, well, actually, you're wrong, because blah, 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 they're all totally different, right? But instead, I try to take a step back now, and I want to ask them questions. Because really, if they're coming to you and they say something wrong, you could just always tell them the answer. But that's usually a lot less interesting. Because most of us are in this because we like to explore things on our own. We like to look at the computer. We like to figure out new languages and new concepts. So what's a lot more practical is when somebody comes to you for advice, but they say something wrong, is to start asking them questions about it. So when, in this case, if someone comes to me and says, oh, Steve, an abstract class and an interface are exactly the same thing. That's stupid. What a stupid language. My first thought is like, well, okay, what about them is the same? And they would say, well, you can put function signatures on both and represent them that way. And I'm like, oh, okay. Can you have fields on both? And then suddenly they might be like, you know what? I don't know. I've never actually seen a field on an interface before. And that might be the whole interaction. Now they can kind of get to run back, and they've got a clue to solve this puzzle of something they maybe misunderstood. And so they can say, all right, well, let me go, can you have a field on there? Let me try to type it in the editor and see what happens. And, you can't, and that's another clue, right? And it lets them figure it out on their own, whereas if I just told them, it would have been a lot less interesting. So those are two interactions, and those two skills sound so easy to talk about, to say, well, if someone comes to you and they're stuck on something, first you empathize with them and ally with them rather than trying to defend the language or the tool. And then the other one, when they come and they say something wrong or they have like some kind of misunderstanding that's fundamental, rather than just correcting them and giving them the, well, actually, blah, 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 instead try to ask them questions and let them discover what it is that perhaps they misunderstood that's fundamental. And sometimes when I've done the question asking thing, I've found out that I misunderstood something, right? I'm like, oh, really? Well, what about blah, blah, blah? And I start asking through what I thought about it, and then they're like, well, actually, it is blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh, I did that. I realized that I would have been in the wrong if I had tried to give them the lecture about what I thought. So those two things, they seem so easy. And I'm able to explain them in 5 minutes, but they take a long time to master. And they are very, very difficult because they run very counter to our natural ego, which is to try to defend the tools that we use, that we think our ego is tied to, and also when someone comes and says something wrong, to use our ego to just, bombast them with what the right answer is. And those two things are going to make you a better learner too, because when you go to try to learn something new, you're going to find that not everybody's a very good teacher, right? Not everybody's gotten the chance to learn and practice these two things. And even if they have, in my case, many times I've wasted an opportunity where I accidentally kind of let my ego run wild and missed an opportunity to really help somebody. So it'll make you a better learner if you realize that. A good example was, I was trying to write something about Haskell the other day, and I was trying to write up a post about it. And I wrote it up, I thought I had it all working, all the code worked, all the samples were right, and I think I understood how this thing worked. I posted it up online, and the first person on Reddit's like, this guy's a complete idiot, he doesn't have any idea what he's talking about, and here's all the reasons why he's wrong, and I just got this 500-word essay about how I was an idiot. And and my first reaction, right, is again, my ego wants to say oh, well, no, that guy's dumb, and reply back some kind of flame war or whatever. But because I feel like I've gotten a little better at separating my ego from my tools and my ego from the things I say, that I was able to say, oh, wow, actually, thanks, sir. That was really useful for you to be able to write that up for me. It took you a long time, and I was wrong. And even though, it wasn't the most diplomatic, I still got to learn from it, right? It made me a better learner to be able to separate my ego and practice this. So really, don't let a bad teacher necessarily stop you from learning. But also, when you get the chance to teach something to somebody else, especially as you're going to be going home with all of this information from LambdaConf, use these skills to be able to explain those things to others. So in conclusion, now you might be asking, if I was sitting in the audience and somebody said they spent 450 hours learning Clojure, I would be like, what? 450 hours? How could that possibly have been worth it, right? And in my mind, I would say it absolutely was. And it was a long journey. And it was one that really forced me to come to terms with how I learn and how I work, And more than just learning Clojure, at this point I feel very comfortable in like Clojure, in Scheme, in Racket, and typed Racket, and Common Lisp. So like I ended up covering quite a bit of Lisps through that learning journey. And now I'm able to go back to languages like C# and JavaScript and Ruby, and the concepts that I learned there, I can still apply. Like I can definitely look back and see there was a place before I started doing SICP and after I started doing SICP where I was able to dramatically improve how much I was able to learn and how much I was able to understand about even, code bases in C#. So it absolutely for me was worth it. And really, again, because like what I said at the beginning, if it's hard to learn, it's probably worthwhile. Like if you're struggling with it, that's because it's outside of your comfort zone. You're in that place that's uncomfortable where you're trying to struggle with those new concepts. So if you're feeling completely stuck and completely blocked on something, that's okay, and that's normal. Like that's a normal way to feel as you're learning new concepts and new ideas. If you feel like you're completely blocked, maybe that book isn't right. Like maybe you need to back off, try a different book. Maybe that book isn't right. Maybe a post, maybe videos, maybe blogs. Whatever you need to do, try multiple sources, but don't necessarily get discouraged by it. It's totally normal to feel like these new concepts are hard and hard for you to get used to. And really, there's just no wrong way to do it. Like if I explained that thing to you about how I tried all these books and tried all these concepts and ideas, that worked for me. And there's no wrong way about it, right? It was a couple of different languages, a couple of different tools, and yet it was all okay. Like it got me to the end goal. Even though at the time, maybe it seemed like I was just trying lots and lots and lots of dead ends. So don't despair and just try a different topic, try a different book, maybe a different language would be better. So really, I like to think of what we do is that we're like athletes of the mind. We spend our time training ourselves, preparing ourselves, teaching ourselves all these new things, much like an athlete would do. And a quote I read the other day, I thought is exactly, just represented my feelings about how I teach myself. And I tweaked it a little bit. It's technically about fitness, but I tweaked it to be about learning. And so I was going to leave you with this quote. A well-trained mind is more than vanity. It shows discipline, dignity, and dedication. It requires patience, passion, and self-respect. It cannot be bought. It cannot be stolen. It cannot be inherited. It cannot be held onto without constant work. Good luck, and thank you for listening. Yes?
Silly question.
Yeah.
So what Clojure book would you recommend? I was going to ask.
Yeah. Well, the one that works for you, but also I liked Clojure programming a lot. I thought it was easy for me to read and understand without any prior experience in functional programming at all. And once I finished that, though, I really would say Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs is the best book I know for functional programming. And it's extraordinarily hard. It's not specifically about Clojure, but by the time I'd finished that, I felt like I could just skim a syntax tree for how Clojure is built, and it made a lot of sense. So a lot of the decisions that go into Clojure, you end up having to build in SICP, and surprisingly, a lot of the things, when I got to the end of SICP, I said to a friend of mine, kind of half joking, I think this is a reference manual for how to build Clojure. So I thought it was very helpful for me, and I strongly recommend that as probably the best programming book ever.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes? It does differ in a number of ways. That's a big topic I won't necessarily be able to cover here, but the biggest thing I would say for how about a practical way, the biggest way that I found it differed from Scheme is that I can use it and interop with Java libraries very easily. And so at work, when everyone says, it's got to be Java, it's got to be JVM, Clojure works on the JVM, and so I was able to use it for that. So that would be the biggest difference. Yep. Yes?
So one thing that I have noticed in my time learning new things is you were very upfront and honest about how much you struggled and how much you were caught in a dozen different ditches about, well, this is obviously not getting me anywhere and I don't feel like I've learned anything. And I think that's universal. I think anyone that says, oh, I just read SICP in a weekend and now I just know everything, or I just opened up the you know, Haskell compiler and interpreter and just divined how type signatures worked. Like, that seems to be the image that people present.
Yep.
Because we're badass and we just, you know, we're autodidacts and we just learn everything through osmosis or whatever.
Yep, absolutely.
But we all we get our face bashed into walls.
Yep.
We keep doing it.
Yep.
So.
That's why I wanted to give this, really, is that I wanted to normalize that it took me a long time, and it was worth it, but it was definitely a large investment. Anyone else? Okay, great. Thank you very much.